Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence Seminar on the Art of Teaching Children's Literature. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offering seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series of events on the art of teaching. On April 11th and 12th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, it's the Art of Teaching American History. To learn more and to register, please visit the website for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence at k12.hillsdale.edu. Click on the Events tab and look for the Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In September 2023, Dr. Daniel Coupland, professor of education at Hillsdale College, spoke to a gathering of teachers and school leaders in an address titled Tried and True Pedagogy.
Let's talk about tried and true. You have the book, and hopefully you will use it for something other than sleeping medicine or to get a fire started on a cold night. Hopefully it'll be useful for you. What I'm going to do here today is I'm going to try to give you some instruction on how to use it. And I'm primarily going to be talking to those of you who are senior faculty members. Because as you will hear, I think a lot of what depends, or in order to get quality instruction at your school, there's a heavy load that you're going to have to carry. And if you're not carrying it, you're probably not doing your job. Let me just be candid. Because if we want great teaching to occur at our schools, you have to take on the responsibility of educators in your building beyond your own room. So that's harsh words to get going. Let's move on from there. If you'll notice in the title, I have, it's a primer, by the way. Those of you who have read the preface, we already talked about that. It's pronounced primer, right? So it's a primer on sound pedagogy. What do I mean by that? Well, we're not going to go into the original Greek on this. I'm just going to say that sound pedagogy, think in terms of good teaching. Now, immediately you might object to that. You might say, wait a second, aren't we interested in great teaching? Isn't that the goal? Well, I would agree with you on that. So let me introduce you to someone. I don't know if you'll recognize her first. I would argue that this is a great teacher. So, well done. Annie Sullivan. That's exactly correct. In fact, here's Annie Sullivan with her most well-known student, Helen Keller. In fact, I love this next image. This is Annie and Helen later in life coming together. If you have never seen the play, The Miracle Worker, you can still read the text and enjoy it. And as an educator, you'll see things that most readers will not see. Helen actually wrote her own autobiography as well. That is an incredible read. Annie Sullivan also wrote a book as well. But I would recommend that you take a look at The Miracle Worker, especially as an educator. She is a great teacher. And we long to be great teachers. So when I was starting out in my career, and in fact, if you read in the preface there, you'll know the opening line of the book is, my first year of teaching was rough. It certainly was, and I've already made reference to this. If it wouldn't have been for the French teacher down the hallway, I would have probably never seen year 2 of my teaching career. And I explain in the preface how she kept me sane and helped me when I needed that help. So one of the most common books that I refer to people who are interested in teaching. In fact, I would argue if you enjoy tried and true, the next book you should read is The Elements of Teaching. It's an incredible book. It goes well beyond what I've articulated in this little short primer here. And it actually identifies some key elements that will help teachers and lead them on to move from good to great. But as a new teacher, when this book originally came out, it's now in its second edition. The second edition came out in 2017. The original came out in 1997. And as a new teacher, I read these words. It was refreshing because although the French teacher, who was about 5'4" and very quiet and held her hands like this, I was nothing like this woman. And I thought she was a great teacher. And then I read these lines, and it really helped me. There is no single ideal character for teachers. Thank goodness. What a relief that I don't need to be a 5'4" French teacher, woman. Human types being infinitely varied, many very different kinds of character can work in a classroom. So what's our job then? They go on to say, all teachers ought to accept their own natural traits and strive to make them work in the classroom for the benefit of their students. We should not all look the same in the classroom in how we teach. In fact, what makes us great is when we do this right here. We embrace who we are, we embrace our experience, and we use those for great effect in the classroom for the aid of our students. So let me talk about where this book, Tried and True, is aimed at. Number one, I hope none of us are going to be satisfied by poor teaching. In fact, I would argue it's not good enough to say we're adequate teachers. Hopefully, we're all striving to be at least good teachers. But ultimately, if we want to be great teachers, it's going to require something else. In fact, I would argue that you can bring a group of teachers together to cultivate their greatness, but oftentimes it involves one-on-one conversation. In fact, great teachers are cultivated, I would argue, best in a mentoring relationship. I'm very grateful, you just heard from one of my mentors, Dr. Whalen. I'm very grateful that when I arrived at Hillsdale College, that he was in a position to mentor me and to lead me. And I already identified John Fennell, my former chair. They were mentors. They helped cultivate me. And hopefully I'm moving in the direction of great teaching. So Tried and True is not pitched at great teaching. It is pitched at good teaching. It's meant to be the foundation upon which we can build. And if you've read in the preface, I said this, it's very easy to say that teaching is an art and then just leave it there. Well, for the first year teacher, that's of no help whatsoever, right? Oh, teaching is an art. You'll know it when you see it, kind of a thing. That does nothing for the rookie teacher. So we have to agree on fundamental principles that we can say this is good teaching, and ultimately we are willing to even break those rules. So in the preface, I actually talk about the model for Tried and True is the elements of style, where White actually says pretty much the same thing, that great writers will actually break the rules, but oftentimes they know the rules first. Or if early on they don't know the rules, they act in accordance to those rules. That's the same thing with teaching. You have to start somewhere. And to leave rookie, novice teachers with teaching as an art is unhelpful. So we need to do more than that. So that's why, first of all, I want to talk to you who are senior faculty members. And what I mean by that is you've made it past the third year, right? So as you well know, the first year of teaching is often the hardest, right? And the second year of teaching is hard, but not as hard as the first year. It's only about the third year when you can pick your head up and go, there are other people in this school, right? That's about the time. And so I get nervous when I have my former students call me November of their first year of teaching and say, I don't think I can make it. And I just say, hold on. You haven't even really experienced teaching yet. There's a certain amount where you're just going to have to go through it and swim to the other end of the pool. And that's what's required. So I want to talk to you, senior faculty, and I'm ultimately going to talk in relation to junior faculty as well. But I want to start with you first. And I want to point out to you that there is a risk in being a senior faculty member at a school. And I think it's best articulated in a wonderful book. If you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It's a very easy read. You can just read it in a couple of hours. But if you need to rekindle your passion for teaching, if you want to see what a lifetime of teaching looks like and the kinds of pleasures that can only come from a career or a vocation in teaching, not 2 years of experimentation, but a lifetime in teaching, this is the book you want to go to. And if you want to have that rekindled. The passage I'm going to show you is about halfway through the book, and it's about halfway through Chips's career. Chips is the main character, Mr. Chips. Now, he retires twice. It doesn't work. They keep dragging him back in. But this is about halfway through his career. Here it is. The school's name is Brookfield, and this is what it says. He had been at Brookfield for over a quarter century. Long enough to have established himself as a decent fellow and a hard worker. Just too long for anyone to believe him capable of anything more. It goes on. We talked about images and metaphors and that. Here's a beautiful metaphor. If you've ever been by the seaside and you've ever seen driftwood, right? Get this. He had, in fact, already begun to sink into that creeping dry rot of pedagogy. How about that for an image? Which is the worst and ultimate pitfall of the profession. Giving the same lessons year after year, he had formed a groove into which the other affairs of his life had adjusted themselves with insidious ease. In order to be a good teacher, you have to develop habits. You do. You wouldn't make it through your day without the habits. In fact, I'm going to talk about routines in a little bit. But you as senior faculty have to ask yourself, are these habits serving my students, or are they just making my life easier as a teacher? That's the risk we run, is that we have these pitfalls that lead to dry rot of pedagogy. And here's the conclusion of the quote. He worked well. See, he was on the whole a good teacher. He worked well. He was conscientious. He was a fixture that gave service, satisfaction, confidence. Everything except inspiration. Doesn't that? Yeah, that's right. Ouch. So I want to encourage you, if you're willing to read Tried and True. Tried and True can operate for senior faculty as a check, right? Have I allowed myself to get into these habits? Are they really serving my students, or are they just serving myself, right? So it's a good check. I'll quote Samuel Johnson on this. You've probably heard this quote many of times. People need to be reminded more often than they need to be instructed. Some of us who have been teaching for quite some time need to be reminded of what good teaching is. So let's talk about junior faculty. Now, I'm still interested in talking to you senior faculty, and you have an obligation, as I hinted at, more than hinted, that you have an obligation for the junior faculty in your school. So just think, if you can, if you work in a school, think of your junior faculty, right? On the surface, they look like this. Don't they? Look at that energy and enthusiasm. All 5 of them have their thumbs up. You walk down the hallway, you pass your junior, how's it going? Right? Because they don't want to show what's really going on. This is the junior faculty in your school. And they need help. They need your assistance. Sure, they have a 4.0 from a liberal arts college. They can quote Cicero, right? They can dissect with the best of them. But this thing called pedagogy and this thing called teaching is something radically new. And so it's up to you to come alongside, as Mademoiselle Nork came alongside and rescued me from my first year of teaching. So let's talk about Tried and True very quickly. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to go through the book, not page by page or chapter by chapter. In the next 20 minutes or so here, I'm just going to try to give you a framework. Ultimately, this is to help, again, it serves as a check for you to make sure you're not slipping into the dry rot of pedagogy. But it's also a way to create a language to have a conversation with your junior faculty members. Some language, some vocabulary, some ideas. Again, I'm the first to admit that this is not going to cover all of teaching, and it definitely is not great teaching. But it's good enough for now, and it should offer the kinds of tools that are useful. So let's get started. There's 5 terms that are mentioned in the book, but the book's not really divided up this way. Let me just show you what they are. There's mission, there's management, we're seeing a trend. There's method, there's material, and then I cheated on this one, measurement. You will notice they all begin with the letter M. So we already heard a pejorative statement about mnemonic devices, I think, earlier. So, oh well. So these are the 5 M's that are useful. Again, I'm talking about providing a vocabulary in which we can talk as educators. And you, as a senior faculty member, can communicate to your junior faculty members. So let's get started. I'm going to go through each of these fairly quickly, but I just want to give you a general sense of what each one of these looks like. So the first thing is mission. Now it's interesting, I taught in a traditional public school before going into higher education, and one thing I'll credit my school district with is that they posted the mission of the school district in every classroom in the entire school district. Not that it was ever referred to a single time in my teaching career, but I'll give them credit, it was at least posted there. In school, what we do in the classroom should be driven by the mission of the institution. Now, I have some pretty hard words in Tried and True, in that if you don't agree with the mission of your school, you probably shouldn't be teaching there. Because if not, you're going to be an isolated element within that school. And it might be great to be the queen or the king of your own castle, but you're not moving towards something noble. You're not moving as a community towards something noble. I would argue that a good mission, here we are. Again, me trying to be alliterative. I promise it'll stop after this. But typically, when you look at a mission statement, and a mission statement is typically a couple of sentences long, no more than a paragraph. In fact, I would argue the shorter it is, the more useful it'll be in terms of using it as an educator. But a quality mission statement typically has references to these 3 H's, the head, the hands, and the heart. Here's what I mean by that. A good mission statement should address the intellect. We want students to know things. We want them to be able to give language to reality around them. We want them to understand the world that is around them. But that's not all. Our students are not just brains on sticks, right? They're more than that. And we have an obligation to also cultivate the skills. And that's what I mean, by the hands. We've actually heard of this. In fact, Professor Gregg talked about it a little bit last night, that we have this obligation not just to give them information, or not even just cultivate knowledge and understanding, but to actually give them tools in which they can learn and use for the rest of their life, and continue to cultivate for the rest of their life. That said, that's not enough. A good mission statement should also, a good education, should do more than just cultivate the intellect and the skills of learning. It should also cultivate the character. We've heard character quite a bit over the last day or so. And this should drive everything that goes on in the school. Athletics, clubs, and especially what goes on in the classroom. All right, I need to keep moving. The second one is management. I tell my students, listen, you may have a love of science. You may want to get into the classroom. You may want to share your love for biology. But if you can't manage that classroom, you'll never be able to inspire your students. And so management comes before method. So this list right here, I would argue, now remember, I came out of the education establishment. I was trained within that establishment. This first statement I'm going to make is highly controversial within, and those of you who have gone through teacher preparation programs know, and you hear this frequently. But here's the statement: teachers should lead in the classroom. That shouldn't be controversial. After all, the administration of the school believes that, the school board believes that, parents believe it, students actually assume it. But it's very interesting that oftentimes we're encouraged to be the guide on the side rather than to be the sage on the stage. So we have an obligation to lead in the classroom. And again, in Tried and True, I said, if you're not ready to lead, you shouldn't be in the classroom. And lead is not just by words alone. In fact, I would say it's much more leading by deeds. Routines are the key to providing a well-managed classroom. I would argue to those of you, if you're managing your classroom through rules, you're doing it wrong. Routines are the ways that you make it from one end of the class to the other. Identify those tasks in your classroom that are common tasks, come up with a routine, teach the routine, hold students accountable. If they're not following the routine, stop them, put the routine back in place. And as I say in Tried and True, if it's a lousy routine, don't hold on to the end of the school year. Stop and tell your students, wasn't that ridiculous, that routine? Well, let's get rid of that and come up with a new routine. But it's amazing how many times what goes on in the classroom is derailed simply because the students don't know what's expected of them. Here's a secret. They want to know the rules of the game. It's your job to articulate what those rules are. Oh, rules. Is in the next one. I'm not opposed to rules. In fact, you need to have rules, but rules govern a common classroom atmosphere, whatever the task is. Routines are specifically designed for specific tasks. Again, the obligation to keep up these things in the classroom is up to you as the classroom teacher. And last but not least is parents. A good teacher recognizes that she or he operates as a resource for parents. And that parents are, despite what you have seen, parents are the first and often the best educators. And we as educators need to respect that, even when we have plenty of evidence to the contrary. When parents do not act in what we think is the best interest of their children, we still have an obligation to respect that. And there are ways in which we can, in honoring parents, and maybe even helping to educate parents, can actually draw them into what's going on in the classroom and help us actually manage the classroom in a meaningful way. we can talk about more of that if you would like to in the future. All right, let's talk about methods then. There was some research a few years ago, actually Dan Willingham in his book, the book that I referenced earlier, he pinpointed 2 features that students point to in identifying a good teacher. Students ask kind of 2 questions, and here are the 2 questions. Does the teacher like me? And is the class organized? Those 2 features right there. Is the class organized? Is there some order to the class? And does the teacher like me? And oftentimes, students at least would articulate that's a good teacher. So if you're going to teach, you need to have a plan. And you need to be focused on what is it that I want my students to know, be able to, this should be familiar language to many of you, know, be able to do, or as we've heard throughout the day, what do I want them to experience, right? And articulate that, make sure it's clear in your mind, and then also make sure it's clear in your students' mind. Articulate to them that this class is ordered, there is an organization. Now I talk about in Tried and True the idea of a loose grip. If you don't have any grip whatsoever, it's going to be chaos. If you have too tight of a grip, you're going to miss out on a lot of the things that Dr. Whalen was talking about. You need to have a grip, but you need to hold it loosely. And you need to allow those moments of wonder to occur in the classroom. But that doesn't get you off the hook from planning. If you've ever read, I was talking to a couple of people, and they've read John Milton Gregory's The 7 Laws of Teaching, written in 1884, I believe it was. And one of the things I learned from him is review, review, review. Now, I currently teach graduate students the class Classical Pedagogy and Curriculum. And in my class, if I'm going to tell them, listen, you need to, in your teachers, cultivate a sense of review, well, then I have to demonstrate it. So in my graduate level class, we usually spend the first 5 to 7 minutes reviewing what we did last time. And I usually start the class with something like, what do you remember from last time we were together, right? What was the most important thing? What did you carry from class last time? That's a very broad general question. Or it may be very, very pinpointed where I'm asking particular questions, right? If you read Willingham's text, he talks about the idea of connecting to what we would call prior knowledge, right? That deep knowledge that we have that we need in order to make sense of the world around us. Well, if you can draw on students' prior knowledge, whether it's their knowledge of the world or the knowledge of the last time you had class, that's your job. In fact, John Milton Gregory, way back in 1885 or 1884, he says, if you complain of your students not remembering what you told them yesterday, that's your fault, right? The immediate question you should ask yourself is, how many times did I review what I taught them 2 weeks ago? So since I introduced the capitals of South America 2 weeks ago, how many times have we reviewed it since then? That's your job, right, as a teacher. So we need to review. In fact, I would argue that a good quality lesson begins with a review and a preview. Class, what did we do last time? Engage in the kinds of questions we heard last night from Dr. Gregg, right? And then here's what we're going to do today. Class, what did we do last time? We multiplied fractions. Guess what, class? You're exactly right. Today, we're going to divide fractions, right? And just give them a preview, give them a framework on which they can, now that'll sit there until you begin to fill in the pieces. I would argue you can do that at the beginning of a lesson and at the end of a lesson as well. Review what you did the day before and preview the lesson. At the end of the lesson, you say, class, we were just in here for 45 minutes. What are you taking with you? Ask questions about what you just did, and then say, class, tomorrow, we're going to be in this same room 23 hours from now. And guess what we're going to be able to do? Give them something in their mind that'll sit there, even working in the subconscious, and let them know this is what's coming. It's amazing how powerful those connections can actually be. It's 30 seconds of your time, 2 minutes of your time, but it has an amazing impact on what your students can know. There's a lot of conversation about learning styles today in education. Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? Are you a kinesthetic learner? I would argue that how you teach a subject depends upon the subject itself. Let me just leave it there. I say more in the book. But I also would argue that there's this thing that cognitive psychologists call dual coding. Don't just tell them, but show them. In fact, doing those at the same time actually is a powerful way to communicate, and I call that show and tell. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on questions because Professor Greg did a great job. Let me just say this, though. You have at your disposal a wide range of questions. Close-ended questions, open-ended questions. So what, where, when, all the way up to the how and the why. Those should be at your disposal. Don't just think it's only the why questions. So if you in your class try to pose a why question, and your students look at you blankly, it's probably because that you haven't led them to the point where you can ask them one of those great questions. I would argue that leading a discussion in a classroom is probably the hardest thing to do. For rookie teachers, if you're going to counsel a novice or a rookie teacher, encourage them to start small. Have a 5-minute discussion in their class. If you see them writing in their lesson plan, Moby Dick, 45-minute discussion. Just go, let's start with 5 minutes, get some victory there, and then let's move on to maybe 8 minutes. Early on in my career, my job was to go in and observe pre-service or teachers who were in their first couple of years. And I can't tell you how awkward it is when a teacher has written, have a discussion in the lesson plan, and you're in the back of the room, the teacher throws out a question, and it's dead. Or they talk for about 2 minutes and you realize there's nothing else in the lesson plan. So my encouragement, especially for newer teachers, get some victory leading a small discussion and work your way out from there. I also say in the book, ask your administrator who in the school is really good at leading a discussion, and go observe that teacher, even if it costs you a planning period. See how it's done and then ask that teacher, how do you do it? What do you do to get ready to do that kind of a thing? Last comment on group work. I'm highly skeptical of group work just because I've seen it abused. I also have seen it in my own experience when I was a young person and I would hear the teacher say, okay, we're going to do a small group activity. Immediately I would go to this position. Oh, crap. Because I knew that I was going to be placed into a group of about 4 other students, and I knew me and maybe one other person was going to have to carry the load for everyone. So what that meant was, I'm not going to do the work of one, I'm now going to do the work of at least 3, maybe 4 students. I use group work even in my classes at Hillsdale College, but I keep the groups small, I keep the time short, I keep the subject focused, and I hold them accountable, or at least I tell them you may be held accountable at the end. That's how you do a good small group. And small group is not a break for the teacher. Oftentimes it's more exhausting than any other kind of teaching. All right, I'm going to go very quickly. Materials. In talking about children's literature, I already answered this question when I was talking about the moral imagination. There's unabridged, abridged, retelling. All of these are tools at our disposal as teachers, although I would say that there are some good retellings. Abridgments are better, but for the reasons I articulated this morning, I still think the unabridged is the best, allowing them to experience the language. I'm not going to say anything more about materials. Let me move on to measurement for a few moments. It is oftentimes the least enjoyable part of the teaching craft, which is assessment. But it doesn't mean that you can't do it. You must do it. You must do it for the student's sake. You must do it for the parent's sake. You must do it for your own sake. And it should be regular, right? Now, so full stop, period, pause. Okay. I will tell you, I am concerned, though, about teacher burnout, and I think teachers tend to burn out for 2 reasons, and this is from what I've read in the research, but also in my own experience. Teachers tend to burn out for two reasons. One is that they fail to be able to manage the classroom. They never really figure out that teaching is managing a group of students, and they get burned out. It usually doesn't come out in, well, I'm just not a good manager. It usually comes out this way. Well, my administration doesn't back me up. That kind of a thing. That's kind of an indicator that there's a problem. Now, that may be true, that you're not getting the kind of support you need, but oftentimes teachers will say, I'm just not getting the support. Oftentimes what that means is I'm struggling to manage the classroom. So listen for that as well. But the other thing is an overemphasis on assessment. Now, I understand the environment in which we live, the last 2 decades, in the obsession with assessment. Again, I already said it's a good thing, it's a thing we have to do and we should do. But there's been an overemphasis on assessment, and it's almost driving instruction. I don't need to explain that. If you're a teacher, you know what it's been like over the last few years. Let me make a comment about feedback, though. Let me relieve you and administrators who are here. You don't have to offer detailed feedback on every single thing that students turn into you. You should relieve yourself of that obligation. I'm going to make, you can read more in the book, but I'm going to make some general statements. Students tend to make common errors, right? A group of students will make common errors. Focus on the common errors. Now, you may have to offer individual instruction every once in a while, but focus on the common errors. Let me make one more statement about feedback. If you, well, let me say this. As a professor and as a teacher, one of the most discouraging things to happen is when students turn in a paper and you go home with your stack of papers and you plop it down, and while everyone else is having so much fun on a Saturday morning, you're grinding it out, reading these papers and writing detailed comments. One of the hardest things to see is to go back into school the next day, hand out the papers, the students grab them, look at the grade, and then on their way out the door, they drop it in the trash can. And what I want to scream out loud is, that's my weekend you're throwing in the trash, right? For feedback to be meaningful, this is what I've learned. For feedback to be meaningful, 2 things need to occur. Number 1, they need to get it soon after they turn it in. Oh, that's deflating, is it not? So if they turn it in on Friday and it takes me 2 weeks to offer feedback, the longer I wait, the less meaningful the feedback is going to be. That's pretty consistent in the research. So you need to get it back as soon as possible. And that's deflating, which suggests the idea that you cannot offer detailed feedback on everything that students turn in. And again, students make the common error, so you should be able to have assignments, for example, take the assignments, go through the assignments, write yourself notes so that when you go back in on Monday, even if you're not giving them back, you can deal with the common errors that you saw as you were reading them, that kind of a thing. Number 2, students have to do something with the feedback. If they're not doing anything with the feedback, chances are the feedback is going to have minimal impact on your students. So what that means is you need to limit the amount of feedback that you give just in order to survive. In fact, if you're spending more time on assessment than you are on planning, I don't want to be harsh here, but you're probably doing it wrong, right? You should be spending more time on preparing great lessons, right? And maybe less time offering that detailed feedback. You need to come up with ways of communicating with your students in order to do that. But you have to have them do something with the feedback. Those are the 5 M's. Let me just point out to you that in Tried and True, if you want, it's not in the book, but you can almost take a look at the table of contents, and you can see that chapter 1's on mission, chapters 2 through 6 is on management, 7 through 12 on methods. I don't really say much about materials because that's more about curriculum, and then the last 2 chapters are about measurement. I can tell you, as a person who used to go and observe student teachers and then observed teachers early on in their career, Typically, I would observe an hour and then I would have a conversation with my students after that. And 80% of the time, we talked about classroom management, just because they had to get that under control. So don't be surprised, senior faculty, if the problem that your junior faculty are actually dealing with has to do with management. All right, in conclusion, I'm actually going to read you the conclusion of Tried and True. Please don't read along because that's embarrassing. There's a danger in writing a book that's 100 pages or less than 100 pages long on a topic as complex as teaching. So I just want to communicate to you that I'm not trying to answer every question. So here's what I say. Teaching is incredibly complex. New teachers who expect perfection from the start of their teaching careers will be sorely disappointed. Although some educators come to the profession with incredible natural abilities, we've all seen it, maybe you're one of them. The best teachers, like the best chefs, athletes, and artists, take years of learning, focus, and practice to hone their craft. New teachers should recognize their shortcomings, look for alternative methods, by observing their experienced colleagues, try other approaches, and never, ever give up. I added the ever in there. Thank you very much.
That's Dr. Daniel Coupland, Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, and his lecture, Tried and True Pedagogy. To learn more about the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence and to register for upcoming events, go to k12.hillsdale.edu, click the Events tab, and look for Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.